All right. Joining me for this special conversation is someone who is running for office for the House of Representatives, House of Representatives in Utah. It's none other than Dee Grey.
Yes.
Yes, Dee. Welcome to the show.
Yep.
Just want to make sure I was saying
Thank
that
you.
correctly.
Perfect. No worries, Jonathan. It is Dee Grey, Grey. I am running here. I decided to run in order to just really provide options. Our area has never had a Democrat run or anybody else really. And so I feel like democracy can't function without choices at the very least. And second, I really do believe that good politics requires accountability. I like to call it kindness, but I think we've been missing it. And so that's what I want to be bringing back to our politics here, is kindness. So I'm running on a platform of kindness, but that's the, again, difficult work of accountability, of letting someone know, hey, you've got some spinach in your teeth. Even if they might get embarrassed and maybe even take it out on you a little bit, they're going to feel like that was a kind gesture from you in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And I find that the message that you're giving, in your campaign, I have to say two things about it. One, it is both quintessentially Utahn, in my opinion, because Utah's political culture, in my opinion, makes for the perfect place for you to give your specific message. Trump did not do well in your state. By historic standards, he did very poorly. There were plenty of people who voted for Mitt Romney in 2012, then for Evan McMullin in 2016, and then many of them voted for Biden this time around. And I think it's because they were looking for a candidate, essentially with that kindness factor. But at the same time, it's nationwide. It's a very unusual message, at least from what I've experienced, because there are so many people who are just eager to run to one extreme or the other, and to regard the other side as not just one's opponent, but essentially the embodiment of evil. I've seen that all the time, but your message is very much the counter of that.
What's interesting about this message that I like is that, and the reason, I think you're attaching to it as well, is that in the end, those two extremes are effective. They're effective at getting people out to vote. They're effective at getting people passionate enough to go out and volunteer or protest, whatever it is. I don't want to feel like, hey, these extremes are themselves bad, right? We've always had extremes within our politics. We've always had people that want to drive us one way or the other. And in the end, most of us have said, yeah, but here's what America means to us. So yes, you can have these extremes, but America means this at least. So if you're going this way on one extreme, we're not interested. But if you are going that way on another extreme, we might get interested because it aligns with our American values. Same thing going the other way, right? Both extremes have values, and I don't think that a lot of politicians will love that. Both extremes have value, and I think 98% of what we want here is the same. And in the end, the last 2% where we miss, these are just the outcomes, the consequences of the data-driven effect that we have on our politics. I know exactly what message I should be saying, the order I should be saying it, in order to entice someone the most. But that doesn't actually give them a relationship with me. And right. That's what I think is really missing. So yeah, this whole thing with Donald Trump, and we can't, that itself is, I think, indicative of when we dropped kindness for niceness. Because Donald Trump's not nice, but when he's mean and other people support him, it's nice to say, okay, it's fine if you are mean with this person. But it's kind to say, you're being harmful to some people. And it's okay that you want to be harmful to some people, but I get to also give you feedback about that. I get to feel a way, and I get to interact with you in a way. So that's just consequences. I think Kindness is really understanding our actions have consequences. It's okay for us to hear those. It's okay for us to absorb them. It's okay for us to want to change or not want to change. But we all have to admit that we're not perfect. We've got to start there. And that is too often you challenge anyone on anything and they immediately go into anger mode, right? They cannot respond to you. And we have to start practicing feedback. We have to. We have to start hearing when we've done something wrong and being willing to accept that we have, because that's community. When we've done something wrong, we should move forward.
I mean,
sorry, I rambled there for a minute.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we could just stop the interview right there because that's I couldn't have put it more perfectly like that. But I mean, I think it's worth to get into some of the issues because you insist that on 98%. We agreed on 2% that we disagree, but it seems like that 2% seems to stick out a lot. And let's if you don't mind, like let's talk about some of the issues that Utah legislature might be taking up, because starting off, interestingly enough, I want to talk about specifically the issue of LGBT rights, because Utah has a very interesting history on that. Just last year, the Utah legislature did pass legislation mandating biological sex segregation in sports over the objections of the governor, interestingly enough, the very conservative Governor Spencer Cox. But it's also worth noting that just a few years ago, Utah, I believe, did pass an anti-discrimination bill that is very unusual for a red state like Utah. And so I always found that Utah has this very interesting political culture that's very unique, but I found it very interesting that the approach that they've taken on LGBT rights, when many other states would just say just basically go to one extreme or the other, like with red states just completely rejecting LGBT rights and blue states more embracing it, even when one might say, well, maybe there's this to think about as well. You know what I'm talking about?
And I do, and that's where I'm trying. So I am trans and non-binary. My pronouns are they, them, and so queer issues are obviously very personal to me. They're not my main issues because I feel like they're well, I can get into that at another time. What I want to say is it's important to remember a few things. One, we're all human, right? We are all going to change. None of us are the same people we were yesterday. In fact, I'm pretty sure if we would have continued this interview this morning, it would have been a completely different conversation because we're both two different people now. That's the way I look at the legislation. 10 years ago, or a little bit more, we passed Amendment 3 to our Constitution that took away the right for any marriage that is not between a man and a woman and anything like it. So you can't have civil unions, you can't have, you can't even get common law married, even if you're living with your partner for 20 years. And we saw that limit partners' ability to visit their hospital beds. We saw it that they couldn't actually receive their death certificates, and they had to go to their family that was not supportive. And those sorts of things were passed a really long time ago. Utah started changing. We started growing. We started having a much larger queer movement. We started getting a lot of acceptance within the local, let's say, culture. Because I don't want to point at a particular religious movement, but there is a culture there. And as it was moving that direction, it got stopped, right? Trump came and changed the conversation. Since then, their conversations around queer rights have aligned with literally everyone else's. There's no way that legislation that gave us those protections a few years ago would pass now. We have different legislatures. They're using different data to say, hey, if we push on this queer issue, especially around schools, we're going to get more votes out. Even if it's not true, even if it's harmful for queer kids, it gets the votes out. And so that's what they've done. So I I'm not trying to paint this purely as them doing something wrong, but recognizing, yes, there is always complexity in these issues, but I don't see complexity now because I don't see any effort for collaboration. And so what I mean by that is, let's actually look at what we're talking about here. Defining a contract that one person can have with another that the state recognizes so that you can manage property and children should that contract end. Yes, there are religious aspects to it. That is so fantastic. We can have lots of conversations on the separation of church and state. But at a state level, we do not want, with no evidence, and in fact, more evidence supporting, pushing and supporting gay marriage helps the community overall. And so pushing back against it, we're actually pushing back against good data. We're pushing back against good community for a single belief system in a state that has 50, 60, 100 belief systems. I think it's okay to say, yes, we are complex, but we are making the wrong decision now. We're making harmful decisions that are making it very difficult for queer people just to go to work. When you don't know if you can live here in a week because they might come and try and take your children away like they are down in Texas, that makes it hard. These choices, these directions are actually economically impacting us. They're making it harder for us to be an effective country. And that's just kindness in recognizing they wouldn't want the opposite. We just turn it around. You're only allowed to marry the same sex. How reasonable would that be? It wouldn't be. Sure, we could even manage, we say marriage is part of how you make kids, but it doesn't have to be. That's the way we structure our society right now. We could create a society where everyone has to get married, only gay marriage, and then we have kids somewhere else. The point is, at its core, we should provide liberty and justice for all. And how that's defined is by the individual, as long as it doesn't harm someone else.
For sure. And Ben, to me,
that was a long one again.
I know. And to me, this, it kind of plays back to what I've been saying about, one end or the other, but also those in the middle. You have, like in this case, the LGBT community and their allies on one end. You have some people on the right who still seem intent on not recognizing everything that you've just been pointing out, and seemingly wanting to make life difficult for the LGBT community. But in you also have the people sort of in the middle for whom many of us, we've kind of come around in the sense that a decade ago I was against gay marriage. I'm now supportive of it, and I'm also broadly supportive of protections for the LGBT community in a way that maybe I wasn't 10 years ago. But maybe when it comes to gender affirming treatment for minors, maybe I still have ethical concerns about that. Or maybe if my my teenage daughter were competing on a sports team, maybe I would just as a parent, maybe I'd be concerned if there was someone who does identify as a woman, but maybe physiologically is different in that sense. Do you understand at least where I'm coming from? At least as someone in the not on one extreme or the other, someone who is moving in the direction that you are, but maybe is not there yet.
I think this is a really great conversation piece, because we have to recognize everyone takes the journey at their own pace. But it's also okay to recognize that it's a journey. The first thing that I like to talk about when we talk about kindness and politics is, just because two people have different opinions does not mean there's actually two sides to a problem. If I look at 2 + 2 and say it equals 5, that does not mean it is now valid that 2 + 2 = 5. There are certain things that we can recognize we all actually kind of agree with, and those that don't, it's okay to say, hey, in a free country, it's okay for you to get on board. But that said, I don't think it's fair to just say, hey, get on board with it, whatever it is, whenever we say. But it is okay to say, why are we against it? When we run into an uncomfortable situation, is it reasonable to legislate that uncomfortable situation? And that's where I feel that the conservative movement has moved to, is if I'm uncomfortable about something, let's legislate it out of existence. And for a group that is supposed to be not government pro, right, that believes that the government shouldn't solve all of your problems, I fully believe that they've fallen into the trap that anytime I'm uncomfortable and people are challenging the way I view the world, let's legislate our way out of it. And instead, what I think we should be talking about is, how do I give that person the space they're looking to have in our world in the same way that they would want to for me? So a really great example is that trans sports issue. Mm-hmm. Let's dive to the first principles. What is it that people are ultimately concerned about? Fairness.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? They want sports accessibility to be fair.
Right.
But is sports fair?
I guess not.
When was the last time that you went to a sports tryout and the focus was not on who's the best, but how can we make this the most fair?
I'd say that would be very, very early on in like basically in grade school, but not after that.
As soon as we get into high school, that's when our bodies start changing, right? And we start caring, for some reason, about the competition of it all. Mm-hmm. And so it's never intended to be fair. And so we're talking, biological differences that occur in some people with different nationalities are more likely to get them prone to be able to enjoy that sport. Should we say that they can't? No. In fact, we enable that. We pay them millions of dollars to be really good at it, even though they are biologically predisposed to be great at it. So already there's no foundational comparison anywhere. This is not a fair experience, right? This is just from a biological standpoint. If we then shift to socioeconomic standpoints, people with parents that both have 3 jobs so they can barely make the ends meet are not going to have the travel expense and the sports expense to be able to be great at what they're doing. There's no fairness in the way any of our sports exists right now. But we're asking for it because it makes us uncomfortable. And it makes us uncomfortable because we don't know enough about it. When you say, right, teenage daughter, that gives me the best example, because how old is your teenage daughter? How far through puberty have they made it? How much is physical effort actually important to that sport? Right? We didn't separate based off of some kinds of things are one way and some kinds of things are another. We just said all sports, despite the fact that some of them are going to be not very reasonable to separate in adults. But then when we come back to teenagers, most of us don't start puberty at the same time. Most of us don't end puberty at the same time. We certainly don't go through our growth spurts at the same time. And so we're talking about someone that may be taking hormone blockers, and so may have less or different hormones than someone else, which is exactly what everything else is. Everyone else on that team has different levels of hormones because we're all going through puberty. It's the exact same experience that anyone else has. Now, once you get towards the end, sure, you might see additional, and you would, if that person wasn't also probably taking hormone blockers. Those hormone blockers, or if they're on actual, if they're old enough to actually get on testosterone or estrogen, at that point, they're, heading into college, but they're still teenagers. And so I want to talk about that for a minute. It makes them less effective. The transition makes them less effective, but we've even seen through studies that after a year, outside of running, everything else evens out. And that's only because we only studied for a year. If we study for 2 years, someone on estrogen may end up with the exact same running times as everyone else. And the experience we've seen. Trans people are not destroying records. Trans people, and these are adult trans people, they're not destroying records. They win sometimes, just like people that are good at sports win sometimes.
Right.
So,
and go ahead.
So sorry, thank you. For me, it's recognizing, yes, I may feel uncomfortable, but why do I feel uncomfortable? And what am I ultimately asking the government to do about it? Why are we asking the state to get involved in those situations? There's absolutely no reason. Instead, we should rely on high quality coaches that understand these situations because they're trained well to do so. And then they make good decisions with the parents. We shouldn't have the government involved.
Right. And I appreciate, honestly, the perspective that you give and how it, from a small government perspective, why would we get the state involved, in an issue in which, literally the state really has almost no idea what they're doing in a sense. Like, I say that as a small government conservative myself, that, yeah, no, I mean, when you put it like that, it actually makes perfect sense. And I guess I might as well take this opportunity to, talk about the other big issue, I think, where people often cite, the issue of small government, and that is the ruling at the end of the last Supreme Court term that overturned Roe v. Wade, because it's an example of what people often cite, small government as a justification for the position of abortion being legal. I will say that I'm someone for whom the arguments in favor of abortion rights do make sense, unless you believe that the unborn child is a person. And once you believe that, then in my opinion, it becomes more difficult to defend to frame abortion rights on the context of bodily autonomy and small government, because
Absolutely.
I'm just curious, how you would see it, because it's another example, I think, of people who, have come at it from a fundamentally different, point of view. And it's particularly when it comes to the issue of conflicting rights versus one person's rights. It's often not seen that way. It seems like, we're willing to characterize the other side in the worst possible light instead of, understanding, exactly where it is that they're coming from.
I really appreciate that you did that labor to bring me to that point, because that's exactly where I take it to. In the end, most people on other sides of this, on either side, just have a different view. They have different priorities. It's okay to have different priorities. The question then comes down to, what do we really want the state to do about it? And what are the consequences of allowing the state to do that? We recognize very, very much that precedence is huge here. Even if we get rid of it, it still sticks around for quite a while. So that precedent, let's really honestly ask ourselves what that is. Let's assume that it's a life, right? I'm not arguing that it's not, but let's start from that base assumption that it is a life. Let's also start from the base assumption that it starts at conception. Cool. When should the state be allowed to say, your body is required for the survival of that person, and allow you to be forced to support the survival of another person? Really good example that I've heard. You can walk up, you can stab a guy in the kidney 3 times. You cannot be forced to give that person a kidney. Now, you can say, you know what? You're right. I should. That was my bad. I'll give you a kidney. All the way up until the moment that kidney comes out of your body, you can say no. You can say, no, never mind. I changed my mind. And that person has to deal with whatever consequences your change of mind has. Let's say you get in a car accident, and by some freak situation, you both have the same blood type, and they ran out of the blood, they hook you up, you're keeping this person alive. Should you be required to stay hooked up to that person?
Right. And that that is the it is I will admit, it's the only argument I think I've heard before that that at least in favor of abortion rights, that at least acknowledges the existence of at least a competing entity, and whatever rights that they may have. And that I whether or not I agree with it, I mean, I don't know. But at least the ability I can appreciate, where you're coming from, because you at least acknowledge where I'm coming from. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. And so, I mean, I will admit though, I'm not as familiar with local Utah politics. So I'm assuming there's a whole set of issues that you really want to run on and you really want to talk about. But I'm just, so please let me know what your priorities are. I'll admit, I went onto your website. There was a couple things I saw, but I couldn't get. I'll admit, I couldn't get a sense off the website what it is that you're hoping to do if you get elected.
That is a really great point. We're actually doing a rebrand on my website right now. I'm really excited about, but that wasn't totally unintentional. In the end, I think a lot of people really want to hear, here's the problem I'm going to solve. Let's be real. When I win, I'm going to hopefully break the Republican supermajority here. If I don't break this Republican supermajority, I basically do not have to be asked about anything that we pass in our state, right? No one has to ask me anything. And so while people really want to hear, here's the things I'm going to solve, if you want to help solve problems, talk to your neighbors about breaking the Republican supermajority. Not because you necessarily agree with Democrats, but because as soon as there's one party that rules consistently without any accountability, they get to decide what we do in our day-to-day lives, and they have been. So that is one of my priorities, is actually bringing accountability to our political process, helping people recognize we the people means you. We cannot build this more perfect union by allowing other people to manage it. That's why we have a democracy, but we also recognize we cannot do 100% of the effort, which is why we have a republic. But it's got to be both. If we want to have a free country, it has to be both. So for me, I'm pushing for the very real understanding that our politics are not just a representation of who we are, but our ability to succeed as a country. We can't succeed if we're a monoculture. Only diverse cultures have ever succeeded. This is business. Businesses are recognizing that diverse, healthy, culturally competent companies are almost always more effective. They are almost always more innovative, and their employees are always happier, regardless of pay. That is something that applies everywhere. If everyone gets the ability to just walk around and feel okay about who they are, and no one's going to try and take away their life, we do better as a country. So that's my main issue, is helping people recognize, as you vote for me, there's more work to be done. I am going to focus on accountability for our ballot initiatives. We've had 3 major ballot initiatives that the legislature just threw away, that Utahns said, this is what we want. And the legislature said, you don't get it. 3 times. And everyone complains about it, but no one does anything. That is one that I want to challenge and say, you want your government to be responsible to you, you have to make them responsible to you. So I'm really pushing for that understanding that kindness is feedback. It is saying, hey, you're grounded because you did something wrong and you're not understanding it, and I need you to take some time to think about it. But that will hit issues around abortion, around because 70% of Utahns want access to abortion, and yet we banned it way further than even 90% think that it should be banned. We have a government that is not representing us locally or nationally. And that's the second thing that I want to run on. And that is, if we're running states' rights does not mean tyranny by the states. Individual states still get to be responsible for creating a free society. We don't get to make some Christian state here. We get to recognize there are lots of people and all of them deserve equal access to liberty and justice for all. So that is my big push. I'm pushing that through education because my opponent wanted to regulate teachers on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis. I feel like government should enable the very well-educated teachers that we have. Instead of pushing them out of education, we should be drawing them into education. We should be giving them salaries. In the same argument that CEOs, if they're not here teaching our kids to be the best that they can, they're somewhere else. And instead, we should have them here teaching our kids to be the best that they can. Because that will ultimately end up working way better for us than that one person creating their one individual contribution to a company. So education, accountability, and environment. Accountability also hits the environment area. We have to recognize here in Utah, our lake is going to kill us. And we can solve it by pumping water into it from the ocean, and it will cost us billions of dollars, but we should at least acknowledge how we got here and recognize some regulation is valuable. And we can see in this state that the companies around us are not willing to be responsible for our health. And if they're not, it's up to us to create that. And it's, I think, makes the most sense for a government to do it because it's the most responsible to its citizens, as long as it actually has some democracy. So those are my main issues. But in the end, what I really, really care about is changing the conversation. As I go knocking door to door and giving people a non-binary person to talk to that approaches these issues in a way that is not angry, but is still holding someone account for their bad behavior, I think will help us change the conversation so that even if I lose, Jordan Tusher will be an ally. He'll maybe start being a little bit more kind. Maybe he'll start being a little bit more empathetic to experiences that are not just his. And that's worth all of the money I'm investing in my own campaign.
And Dee, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I'm glad that the residents of your district have a real choice this November. And I hope that the viewers who are watching understand why it is that I love these long form conversations a lot more than I like Twitter.
Oh my goodness. Twitter's fun. I love being able to interact with people that I would never be able to interact with. There's certainly something really cool about saying something snarky and have 13,000 people be like, I like you. But it does not allow us to engage, right? It doesn't really allow us to engage. We're trying to speak to the people that already like us. I don't want to speak to the people that already like me. They already like me. I want to speak to everybody else. And that's a lot harder to do on Twitter for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. It, playing to the base is one thing, but building support and building a movement, that's a whole nother ball game. And I'm glad there are politicians on both sides who are there to do that, because I think that's how the real work gets done. And you want to plug in anything before we end this off?
I do. I want to plug two things. First, I want to plug Governor Cox. He has done amazing things. And a lot of it is the same reason I'm running. He went out and he spoke to people and he gained a little bit better understanding. And then he brought that and allowed it to change him. I think that's really, really cool. It's also the reason I'm running with Evan McMullen's coalition, is to really support this idea that we can all really come together on these things. Most of these issues do not deserve to have two sides to them, but it certainly helps pay for clicks, for politicians, for media, for everybody. And that's just unfortunate. And I don't want to succumb to it. But my big plug, please, Dee Grey for Kindness. Come and visit me on Facebook, on Twitter. I prefer the conversations. You might see a couple of my tweets or my Facebook posts are not normal. I am trying to engage with people that disagree with me as much as I possibly can, and not in a you're wrong, but let's make sure you understand what the consequences of your action are. Because if we can say one body is more important than another body, especially if that body is not even a citizen, why would we not allow any other body to support other bodies that we feel as a society are more valuable? The poor to support the rich, for example. So think about it.
Go ahead. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
Please tweet me and reach out because I really want to engage. I want to learn, and I want way more yard signs. So please donate.
For sure. And we got a general election coming up in November. I encourage members of your district to come out and vote, as I do encourage everybody to come out and have your say this November. Dee, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much. Definitely get out to vote. Have a wonderful Tuesday.
Tuesday, yeah.
Have a wonderful day. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.